Eric, get in here and do the dishes.
Mama Johnson's voice rang out from the kitchen, sharp and demanding. Eric sighed, setting his book down. From the living room, he could hear his stepbrother, Daniel, laughing loudly with his friends. As they played on the PS4, the sound of noise and explosions from the game filled the house. Eric, she called again, impatience dripping from her voice. I'm coming, he muttered, dragging his feet toward the kitchen. Mama Johnson stood by the sink, arms crossed, her expression cold. The moment Eric entered, she stepped back, motioning toward the pile of dirty dishes stacked high. You see this mess? Clean it up, now. Eric glanced at the plates and glasses, some still crusted with food from dinner. But Daniel, but nothing, she snapped.
Do I look like I care what Daniel is doing?
Eric clenched his fists. He knew better than to argue. When Papa Johnson was around, she acted like the perfect mother, sweet, kind, always asking him how his day was. But the moment his father left, the mask dropped, and the real Mama Johnson emerged.
Well, what are you waiting for?
She hissed. Eric turned to the sink, biting his tongue as he started scrubbing. Behind him, Daniel's laughter echoed, rubbing salt in the wound. He was the golden child, the real son, Eric. He was just the unwanted baggage that came with his father's second marriage. As he washed the dishes, his mind drifted. One day, he thought, one day, things will change. He just didn't know when. Immediately after finishing the dishes, Eric barely had a moment to catch his breath before Mama Johnson's voice cut through the silence of the kitchen.
Now, start cooking dinner. I'm feeling too weak to get up,
she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. Eric set the dish towel aside and turned to the stove. His hands moved on autopilot as he prepared a simple meal. The clatter of utensils and the sizzle of the pan were the soundtrack of another long evening in a house where every chore was his burden. Once the meal was simmering, Mama Johnson added another command.
After dinner, go and collect the clothes I gave the tailor to amend,
she said briskly. Without pausing for response, Eric continued stirring the pot, the weight of his responsibilities settling over him like a heavy shroud. His life was a continuous series of tasks, each one a reminder of the unequal world he was forced to endure. While Daniel lounged lazily in the next room,
laughing with his friends as he played PS4,
Eric bore the full brunt of the household's demands. In the quiet hours of the night, when most of the family finally slept, Eric's day was far from over.
At 3 a.m.,
his eyes would flutter open only to be met with Mama Johnson's insistent knocking at his door.
Get up, Eric, there's work to be done,
she would say, her voice unyielding as it summoned him from a few precious hours of sleep. By the time dawn crept through the window, Eric's body was already exhausted from a night of ceaseless chores. In stark contrast, Daniel, who shared the same SSS3 classroom with him, had a life free of these burdens. Daniel would wake up, bathe, and head to school with barely a hint of stress. Their differences were stark, particularly as they faced the pressure of their final exams and the looming JAM exam, a gateway to university that promised a future far removed from the drudgery of their daily routine. For Eric, every chore was a reminder of his status as nothing more than a servant in his own home, a constant struggle against the tide of unfair expectations. Yet, beneath the exhaustion and the resentment lay a small, determined hope. Each textbook he studied late at night, every problem he solved by the dim light of his desk lamp, was an effort to carve out a future where he could break free from the relentless cycle of chores and neglect. As the days edged closer to the exams, that fragile hope became his secret drive, a belief that his hard work, both in the household and in his studies, might one day be recognized, and perhaps against all odds, lead him to a life where he was more than just the shadow of the family, more than the one who had always been left to bear the brunt of Mama Johnson's harsh demands. The day JAM results were released. Eric's hands trembled as he logged into the portal at a cyber cafe near school. His heart pounded, his breath catching in his throat as the screen loaded.
Score, 290.
He stared at it, blinking, making sure he wasn't seeing things. It was real.
290, a score high enough to guarantee admission into a top university.
A deep sense of relief flooded him, followed quickly by excitement. This was the ticket to his future, the escape he had dreamed of. Beside him, Daniel clicked on his result. The moment it appeared, his face darkened.
98.
The silence stretched. Then, without warning, Daniel slammed his fist on the table, startling a few students nearby.
This is rubbish. This system is rigged,
Daniel shouted. The cafe attendant glanced at them but said nothing. Eric swallowed the urge to roll his eyes. They had both taken the same exam, and Daniel had barely studied. What did he expect? They walked home in silence, Daniel fuming, Eric holding his joy tightly within himself. He couldn't celebrate openly, not in a house where his success was a threat. The moment Mama Johnson saw the results, her lips curled into a sneer. She barely glanced at Eric's score before turning to Daniel.
98,
she shrieked, her voice laced with disappointment. Daniel sat on the couch, sulking, arms crossed. The exam was too hard, he muttered. Mama Johnson turned slowly to Eric, her eyes burning with hatred. And you?
290.
Eric nodded cautiously, sensing danger in her tone. Her face twisted into something ugly. She knew what this meant. If Eric went to university now, he would leave Daniel behind. That could not happen. Her mind spun with ideas. Money wasn't the issue. Papa Johnson was already talking about paying for Eric's tuition. Something else had to be done. She took a deep breath, forcing a smile. Congratulations, she said, though her voice dripped with venom. Eric stiffened. That fake smile meant trouble. As the days passed, she barely spoke to him. But Eric knew better. She was planning something. And whatever it was, it wouldn't be good. That night, Mama Johnson sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the ceiling, deep in thought. The dim glow of the bedside lamp cast sharp shadows on her face.
Eric cannot leave before my son.
If Eric went to the university first, Daniel would be left behind, a failure. People would talk. The neighbors would whisper. How could the stepson succeed while her own son remained home like a fool?
No, it couldn't happen.
She needed a plan, something that wouldn't make Papa Johnson suspicious, but effective enough to keep Eric from leaving. Then, an idea formed. A slow, wicked smile stretched across her lips. Over the next few weeks, Mama Johnson's attitude changed. She became strangely nice. She didn't bark orders as much. She even gave Eric small portions of meat in his food, something she rarely did. Eric noticed. This is unusual. Too unusual. Then, one evening, she called him into the sitting room.
Eric, you're almost a man now, she began, smiling warmly. And since you're about to go to university, you should start handling money responsibly.
Eric frowned.
Oh, okay? She reached into her wrapper and pulled out a bundle of cash.
It was a lot.
At least 200,000 naira. I want you to take this money to your father's friend, Mr. Aid, tomorrow morning, she said. He owns that electronics shop down the street. Tell him it's from me, for the freezer we discussed.
Eric hesitated.
But why not give it to him yourself?
She sighed.
Eric, I haven't been feeling too strong lately. And Daniel will be busy tomorrow. Just help me, my son.
The way she said my son made Eric uneasy. She never called him that. Still, he nodded.
Okay, Ma.
She smiled.
Good boy.
The next morning, Eric left early with the money tucked safely in an envelope. He made his way toward Mr. Aid's shop, the sun already burning against his skin. Just as he turned the corner near the market, a loud voice rang out behind him.
Thief! Thief!
Eric turned, confused only to see two policemen marching toward him, fury in their eyes.
That's him!
A familiar voice shrieked. Eric's blood ran cold. Mama Johnson. Before he could react, rough hands grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back.
Where did you get this money, boy?
One of the officers barked. Eric stammered, his mind racing.
It is for my stepmother.
She sent me to. A slap across his face cut him off.
Liar, we got a report that you stole it from the house.
Eric's world spun. He struggled, but they dragged him toward their van. From the corner of his eye, he saw Mama Johnson standing by the roadside, arms folded, a satisfied smirk on her face. She set me up, and there was nothing he could do. On the very day he was supposed to start a new chapter in his life, Eric found himself locked up in a cold, damp cell. The harsh lights above only made his situation feel more real. All his hard work, dreams of escaping, and hopes of going to university were now gone.
Every passing minute in that lonely cell reminded him
that his chance to leave behind the endless chores and mistreatment was slipping away. Outside, life moved on. Papa Johnson, always busy with work and rarely home, had no idea what was happening. His constant absence meant he didn't know about the false accusations and the setup that had landed Eric in jail. His job kept him too occupied to notice the growing problems in his own family. Back at home, Mama Johnson pretended to be worried. To outsiders, she looked like a heartbroken mother, but deep down, she was satisfied. Her plan had worked perfectly. With Eric locked away, he couldn't go to university. Her son, Daniel, would no longer have to compete with him. With Eric out of the picture, she remained in full control of the household. People in the neighborhood whispered about what had happened. Some doubted that Eric was truly guilty. Others pitied him. But inside the house, Mama Johnson felt no guilt. In her mind, she had done what was best for Daniel, even if it meant crushing Eric's future. Sitting in his dark cell, Eric felt the weight of betrayal. His dreams were shattered, but deep inside, a new determination started to grow. He refused to let this be the end of his story, even if the world had moved on without him. He promised himself that somehow, someday, he would rise again. Eric sat on the cold, hard floor of the cell, staring at the rusted bars that separated him from freedom. His dreams of university, of escape, of finally proving himself gone. All because of the woman who had never seen him as family. Days passed. No one came for him. His stepmother had made sure of that. He overheard the officers talking one evening.
"That boy's stepmother must really hate him," one muttered, shaking his head. "The way she insisted we keep him locked up. You'd think he committed armed robbery."
Another officer scoffed.
"It's just 200,000 naira. His father is well off. If he really stole it, wouldn't they have sorted it by now?"
That was when Eric realized his father still didn't know. His heart clenched. Papa Johnson traveled often for work, sometimes gone for weeks. It wasn't unusual for him to be out of touch.
But surely, by now, someone must have told him.
Unless, Eric's stomach twisted.
Mama Johnson must have hidden it from him.
He clenched his fists. He had to get out. One evening, about a week after his arrest, a familiar voice boomed through the station.
"Where is my son?" Eric's heart jumped. "Papa."
A few minutes later, the iron cell door swung open. For the first time in days, Eric stepped out, his body weak but his mind racing. His father stood in the dimly lit hallway, fury radiating from him. His dark eyes locked onto Eric's skinny frame, taking in the dirt-streaked clothes and exhausted expression. "Who did this to you?" Papa Johnson's voice was low, dangerous. Eric hesitated. He had never seen his father this angry before.
"The police said you stole money," his father continued.
"Is it true?" Eric shook his head, his voice hoarse.
"No, Papa. It was Mama Johnson.
She set me up." The silence that followed was suffocating. Papa Johnson turned sharply toward the officers.
"Who filed this report?"
"Your wife, sir," one finally answered. Something in Papa Johnson's face changed. A realization, a deep, cold understanding. Without another word, he took Eric by the arm and led him outside. When they arrived home, Daniel was sprawled on the couch, controller in hand, completely unconcerned. Mama Johnson, however, froze the moment she saw them. "You're back," she said, forcing a smile.
"Thank God. I was so worried."
Papa Johnson ignored her.
"You reported my son to the police?"
Mama Johnson's eyes flickered, but she quickly put on her usual act.
"I only did what I thought was right. He stole."
Enough. The word was sharp, final. For the first time in years, Eric saw fear flash in her eyes.
"You've always treated him differently,"
Papa Johnson said, his voice filled with quiet rage. I ignored it. I thought it was just adjustment struggles.
But you sent him to jail?
She opened her mouth, but nothing came out.
Eric missed his university admission because of you.
Then, for the first time, Daniel spoke. Maybe it's better this way, he muttered.
At least now, he won't leave before me.
Papa Johnson turned slowly to his son. The room went completely still.
Then slap.
Daniel stumbled back, shock on his face. Papa Johnson had never laid a hand on him before. You, he said, voice trembling with anger, are a disgrace. Daniel's mouth fell open, but he said nothing. Papa Johnson exhaled sharply and turned back to Mama Johnson.
I want you out of my house.
Mama Johnson gasped. What? But
you think I don't see what you've done?
His voice was quiet, but each word cut deep. You wanted Eric gone. You made my son suffer.
And you made me a fool in my own home.
She took a step back.
But where will I go?
Papa Johnson's face was emotionless.
That's no longer my problem.
For the first time in years, Eric felt something shift. Maybe, just maybe, his nightmare was finally ending. The house was quieter after Mama Johnson left. The air felt lighter, freer.
For the first time in years,
Eric could wake up without feeling like a servant in his own home. But despite everything, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing.
His father tried to make up for lost time.
He spoke with the university about Eric's missed admission, but it was too late. Eric would have to wait another year. The disappointment stung, but Eric refused to let it break him. Instead, he threw himself into his studies, preparing to retake JAM. Daniel, on the other hand, became distant. He barely spoke, spending most of his time locked in his room or outside with friends.
Without his mother to cover for him,
he had no choice but to start taking responsibility for himself. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. One afternoon, Eric was walking home from tutoring when he saw a familiar figure sitting outside a small kiosk at the market. Mama Johnson. She looked different, weaker. Her once proud posture was now slumped. Her fine clothes replaced by a simple wrapper and blouse. She was selling small food items, barely making enough to get by. Eric hesitated. A part of him wanted to walk away, to leave her to her fate, but something inside him wouldn't let him. Taking a deep breath, he approached. She looked up, and for the first time, Eric saw guilt in her eyes. Eric, she whispered, shocked. He said nothing at first. Then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. Are you okay? Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly looked away.
I'm managing.
Eric sighed.
Mama Johnson, why did you hate me so much?
She wiped her eyes with the edge of her wrapper.
I didn't hate you, Eric. I was just afraid.
Afraid of what?
Afraid that if you succeeded before Daniel, people would compare them.
That he would be seen as a failure. She shook her head, her voice breaking. I was wrong. So wrong. Eric stared at her for a long time, searching for the truth in her words.
And in that moment, he saw not the monster who had tormented him,
but a broken woman who had let her own insecurities destroy a family. He exhaled.
I forgive you.
Her head snapped up, eyes wide. You what? I forgive you, Eric repeated.
And I think you should come home.
Mama Johnson burst into tears. That night, Eric sat his father down.
Papa, we need to bring her back.
Papa Johnson frowned.
After everything she did to you.
Yes, Eric said firmly.
She made mistakes, terrible ones, but she's still Daniel's mother.
And no matter what, she was once your wife. She has suffered enough. His father remained silent for a long time. Then, with a deep sigh, he nodded. A week later, Mama Johnson returned home. Things weren't the same, they never could be, but there was an effort to mend what had been broken. Daniel, humbled by the entire experience, started taking his studies seriously. He and Eric were never close, but for the first time, there was mutual respect between them. A year later, Eric passed his JAM again, this time scoring 310. When he finally left for university, Mama Johnson saw him off with tears in her eyes. I'm proud of you, Eric, she said softly. For the first time, Eric believed her, and as he walked toward his future, he knew forgiveness had set him free. The end.